This is the brief on Willem Engel's retrospective on the COVID crisis. So, this is all about a really lengthy interview with the Dutch academic-turned-activist Willem Engel. He's looking back on his intense fight against the government's COVID policies and what he claims was some serious coordinated abuse of state power. First up, Engel, who, by the way, actually holds a degree in biopharmacy, argues the media's tactic was pretty simple. Just brand him a dance teacher to completely dismiss his scientific critique. He was adamant the measures were just way over the top, pointing to the 1.5-meter social distancing rule as having basically zero research to back it up. Second, his distrust of the state, well, that wasn't new. He says his family's earlier conflict over his father's property, the Fort Oranje camping, taught him all about the disillusioning mechanisms of state power. He claims the government used secret projects with code names like Maisveld and Bloedkoral, just to ruin opponents, and he thinks they recycled those tactics for the pandemic. And finally, there was a huge moment that really tested the Dutch courts. His organization, Virus Waarheid, won a major, though very brief, victory against the avondklok, which is the Dutch word for curfew. A court ordered the curfew be lifted immediately, but the state shut that down like instantly with an emergency appeal and a brand new law, suggesting the courts just fell in line with the political narrative. The interview provides an intense view of the COVID era through the lens of a scientific critic convinced he was battling a government coup.
Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show built to take a huge stack of sources, detailed research, legal transcripts, and in-depth interviews and deliver the most critical insights right to you.
Our mission today is definitely a challenging one.
It is. We are undertaking a deep, and I want to stress, objective analysis of the scientific, legal, and political claims made by Willem Engel,
Who, of course, very quickly became one of the most prominent and certainly one of the most legally active critics of COVID-19 policy here in the Netherlands.
and we're basing this analysis entirely on his own retrospective accounts.
Right. We've drawn from a series of long-form interviews, which lets us trace his specific journey, the scientific critiques he developed.
And the mechanisms he claims the state used against him.
Exactly. And the judicial setbacks he experienced along the way.
So our goal here is not to adjudicate the policy itself. It's to understand the core arguments that were being presented by the opposition.
We want to dissect the claims of systemic resistance and judicial failure, but all as seen from the perspective of his organization, Virus Waarheid. We're really focusing on what the source material claims about the tactics that define that period.
And we can jump right in with a key tension that really defined the public perception of him.
The dual identity.
Precisely. If you followed the news during 2020 and 2021, the mainstream media consistently framed Willem Engel as simply the dance teacher.
It's a really powerful opening hook because our sources show that this labeling was, at least according to Engel, a very deliberate tactical choice.
And we learn he has this significant academic history that was almost never mentioned.
Right. He studied biopharmaceutical sciences at Leiden University and spent 6 years, we're talking 2002 to 2008, fully engaged in research.
He even submitted a draft of his doctoral dissertation, his Proefschrift.
Exactly. So the sources argue that reducing him to just a dance teacher was a form of caricature, a carefree.
And it was allegedly used by the media, or what he calls shadow power, for two reasons.
Two reasons, yeah. First, it discredited his scientific critique right out of the gate, implying he just didn't have the intellectual rigor to debate virologists.
And second?
Second, it displayed a sort of underlying contempt for physical labor, for the common person. It reinforces this technocratic idea that only people with very specific academic credentials are even allowed to criticize policy.
Okay, so let's unpack this very unusual journey. Because the transition from a highly specialized scientist, someone who wanted to be a professor,
to a professional dancer, and then to a political activist.
it's really the defining feature of his credibility, or maybe the lack of it, depending on how you see it.
It is.
So Engel notes in the source material that his life ambition, and this goes way back to when he was 4 or 5 years old, was to become a professor.
And he was on the right track for it. I mean, he completed these rigorous studies. He was deep in research for over half a decade in a collaboration between TU and Scheide and Leiden.
This was serious high-level scientific work.
Absolutely. A very dedicated path right up until 2008.
And then this abrupt shift happened.
Triggered by what he calls an epiphany. He was traveling, waiting for a flight in Auckland, New Zealand, on a very specific date.
He remembers the exact date.
December 11, 2008. That's when the decision hit him. He was going to dedicate the rest of his life to dance.
That is a staggering pivot. I mean, going from the isolation of a lab
Running experiments, writing a dissertation.
to the highly public, kinetic, and communal world of competitive dance.
Well,
What was behind such a seismic shift?
he describes the lab environment as just fundamentally unfulfilling. He uses words like isolated, cold, and non-physical.
So it was a deep-seated need for something else.
A craving for human connection, for community, for physical interaction that his scientific field, at least in his experience, just wasn't providing. Dance was the polar opposite. It was intensely social and physical.
But the sources suggested the dancer was actually, in a way, training the future activist, right?
Absolutely. And this is where the analysis gets really insightful. He spent the next 12 years honing the skills of performance and communication.
Things you don't learn in a lab.
Not at all. Leading large groups in dance, it requires you to command attention, to stay calm under pressure, and critically, he says, to take people along in a story.
To communicate complex ideas simply.
Yes, to make complex rhythms and steps compelling and easy to follow. And these skills, mastered on the dance floor, became the crucial tools he used for public speaking, for leading demonstrations, and for structuring his arguments later on.
So he traded the research paper for the microphone.
In a sense, yes. But the seeds of his conflict with the state weren't just theoretical. They were planted through a decade-long family legal struggle.
Right. He comes from a scientific family.
Yeah.
His grandfather led an organization that later became T&O Nutrition. But his father, Kees Engel, went into real estate.
And that leads us straight to the foundational event, the one Engel sees as the template for everything that happened to him later.
The Fort Oranje saga.
Starting around 2012, a nationally publicized, very long, and incredibly bitter struggle over his father's large camping site in Zundert.
This was Kees Engel versus the municipality and eventually what he calls the state.
The municipality was trying to shut down Camping Fort Oranje, citing alleged fire safety issues and poor living conditions, even though, it was home to many long-term residents.
And the father's counterclaim was that these allegations were just a pretext.
Exactly. The source material details this extensively. They argue they'd invested heavily in improvements.
Like what, specifically?
Paving over 3 kilometers of roads with asphalt for emergency access, installing new fire hydrants. They argued the core issue was administrative overreach, not a genuine safety failure.
And at first, they actually won in court, didn't they? A temporary victory.
They did. The judge delayed the closure, demanded the municipality clarify its requirements. There was applause in the courtroom.
The win for the little guy.
You'd think so. But Kees Engel's reaction was deeply cynical, and this really shaped his son's view. He pointed out that the PR disaster and the uncertainty had already done so much damage.
Guests had left. Residents were scared.
The damage was already irreparable. The legal victory felt hollow.
And this is where the story takes a darker turn, with these alleged deep state projects.
Codenamed Maysveld and Blood Corral. These terms are used in the source material to describe what they saw as coordinated administrative sabotage.
So not just regulation, but an active attempt to ruin the business.
That's the claim. Secret projects orchestrated by the central government, the REIC. The source details this multi-level attack. For instance, the GGD, the Public Health Service, was allegedly sent to the site.
But the GGD is there to help people, right?
Well, according to the source, their purpose there wasn't to help the vulnerable residents. It was purely to collect incriminating evidence for the municipality to use in court.
So weaponizing a public health service for administrative warfare.
That is the allegation, and it goes further. It details specific acts of alleged sabotage, especially involving the fire department.
What happened there?
The fire department was supposed to test the pressure of the new hydrants. The source alleges that they used a sabotaged closure piece during the test, which made the pressure readings look too low.
Intentionally.
The claim is yes, and that the fire department employees themselves eventually realized they were being used and refused to go back to the site.
This history is presented as the absolute genesis of his entire anti-establishment struggle.
It is. His involvement in his father's legal defense, working alongside his future COVID legal partner, Droen Pols, it solidified a whole belief system for him.
And the final court ruling on that case was bizarre.
Immensely significant for him.
Yeah.
The Council of State, the highest administrative court, eventually upheld the closure for technical reasons, but, and this is the key part, it stated that the government had committed at least 20 crimes in the process.
20 crimes.
That admission, according to Engel, proved two things to him. First, that the state operates outside the law when it wants to ruin someone. And second, that the court, even when it sees massive government misconduct, will still prioritize the administrative goal over justice.
So when 2020 came around and he started to feel persecuted by the state,
It wasn't based on some sudden paranoia. In his view, it was proven by his family's decade-long experience. He felt he had seen the playbook before.
he also asserts the court system itself changed after that.
Yes, he claims that before Fort Oranje, judges might still hold the government accountable. But by 2020, he believed the judiciary had become too willing to just rubber stamp the state's position, acting as allies of the state rather than objective arbiters.
And that is the crucial context we need to carry into the COVID era.
Absolutely.
So that deep history of legal conflict sets the stage for May 2020. The scientist in him re-emerges.
And it was triggered by something very personal and economic. The lockdown forced his dance school to close, bringing his whole life to a halt.
That was the catalyst.
It was, and he admits his skepticism was gradual at first. It didn't start with big political claims. It started with a fundamental breach of trust.
The sequence of events was key.
The government first said, nothing is wrong, downplaying the threat, and then, within a week, imposed a full lockdown. That drastic shift was the first thing that made him suspect something wasn't adding up.
So what was the first scientific rabbit hole he went down?
The 1.5-meter social distancing rule.
Yeah.
He claims that was the moment he literally fell off his chair. As a scientist, his first instinct was to find the evidence base, so he went looking for the papers, the articles, proving the effectiveness of that specific distance.
And what did he find? Or what did he not find?
He claims he found not a single article. His assertion is even stronger than just saying it was unproven. He argues that the effectiveness of 1.5 meters for an airborne respiratory virus had never even been properly researched in the first place.
So this globally enforced mandatory rule lacked a foundational evidence base, in his view.
That became the first major red flag for him, that policy was being driven by something other than science.
And that lack of evidence for the distance rule then frames his entire subsequent critique.
Which rests almost entirely on one word: disproportionality. He called it the most important word of 2020.
The core claim being that the measures, the lockdowns, the closures, the economic damage were completely out of proportion to the actual lethality of the virus.
Exactly. And to prove this, he cites multiple early international studies.
What were the key data points he was looking at to establish the severity?
He pulled data from several early events that allowed for a good look at the case fatality rate, the CFR. He pointed to the Diamond Princess cruise ship data, the Gangelt study in Germany, early New York antibody tests, and the Bergamo study in Italy.
And what was the conclusion from all of those?
He argues they all consistently pointed to a CFR of around 0.1% to 0.2%.
Which is comparable to a severe flu season.
Yes, a factor of 10, 20, or even 30 times lower than the apocalyptic figures that were being modeled in March 2020.
Did his sources address the counter-argument that these early studies might have been on, non-representative populations?
They acknowledge that critique, but dismiss it. They argue that the geographic spread of the data from a hot zone like New York to a closed system like the Diamond Princess provided a strong enough signal that the initial modeling was catastrophically wrong.
So the error, in his view, was basing policy on fear and models, not on early observable data.
Which brings us to the central moral and legal question he raises: the public health trade-off.
If the CFR is indeed that low, say 0.2%, why must 99.8% of the healthy population endure such massive hardship?
The source argues that it's very strange, which is a polite way of saying immoral or illegal, that the vast majority have to pay such a heavy price to save a specific vulnerable group who tragically might die from other causes anyway.
He frames it as a failure of risk management.
A failure of risk management and a total disregard for all the other public health consequences of lockdown.
And who does he blame for failing to adjust to this emerging data?
The RIVM, the Dutch CDC, they're criticized for their institutional rigidity. Engel argues they were just way too conservative, waiting for perfect, double-blind, randomized, peer-reviewed evidence.
Which you just don't have time for in a crisis.
Exactly. He says that in a crisis, the choice of no action is also a choice. And that delay, that waiting for perfect evidence, is often the most dangerous course of all.
He uses an analogy to explain this, right?
He compares it to drunk driving. The accident isn't caused by the initial lapse, the drinking. It's caused by the delayed reaction time, which leads to a violent overcorrection. You slam the brakes too late or you swerve too hard.
And the RIVM's slow, rigid approach led to a disastrous overcorrection.
A massive overcorrection with lockdowns, well after the initial threat assessment was already, in his view, outdated.
This rigidity leads us straight into the aerosol debate.
Which, according to the sources, expose what he calls a pure lie at the foundation of the whole 1.5-meter policy.
This is a crucial technical point. The public health consensus, especially early on, split transmission into two types.
Large droplets, which fall to the ground within a meter or two, justifying the 1.5-meter rule.
And smaller floating aerosols.
And Engel's assertion is that the large droplet theory was a pure lie, a totally crazy story that was invented specifically to give some pseudoscientific backing to the 1.5-meter mandate they had already decided on.
So the policy wasn't based on the physics of the virus.
The physics of the virus were interpreted to fit the policy. If it's droplets, the solution is distance.
But if it transmits via aerosols, like smoke,
Then the solution is ventilation and air quality control. Distance becomes almost irrelevant. And he claims that the work of Vincent Munster, a student of key Dutch virologist Marion Koopmans, had already shown as early as February 2020 that transmission was absolutely aerosol.
which raises a huge question. If the state knew or should have known this, why do they suppress air quality solutions?
Engel's source material claims the reason was deeply cynical.
That the state wasn't interested in solving the problem.
But in implementing the measures that centralized control, things like better ventilation, air ionization, UV sanitation, and crucially early low-risk treatments like HCQ and ivermectin were all consistently ignored or suppressed.
Why suppress effective solutions?
He argues that these solutions are decentralized. Anyone can improve their ventilation. Doctors could prescribe cheap, existing drugs.
It doesn't require centralized government control.
Or mass mandates, or a massive new vaccine program. The fact that these low-risk solutions were ignored in favor of mandates and mass vaccination is something he calls a misdrive, a serious crime.
This realization that the science was allegedly manipulated and solutions suppressed led him to pivot from public health critique to something much more explosive.
The claim that a coup had been committed in the Netherlands.
What evidence does he cite for such an extreme claim?
It's based on the shift in the locus of power. He alleges that from February 26, 2020, the NCTV, the National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism, took the operational lead.
A security apparatus, not a public health ministry.
Which is a critical distinction. His conclusion is that until that summer, democracy was literally non-existent. Normal parliamentary process and debate were sidelined by executive command focused on security and containment.
A shift from a democracy to a security state model.
That's the argument. And when we look at the source material on this alleged coup, the author contrasts two possible interpretations of the establishment's intent.
Right. One is the charitable view.
That they genuinely, though disproportionately, feared the virus. They were paralyzed by paranoia, making mistakes out of excessive caution.
And the other view.
Engel's conviction. That the coup was malicious, intended to suppress, monitor, and control the public, using the crisis as a pretext. This distinction between paranoia and criminality is key to understanding the extreme tone he uses.
And this focus on behavioral manipulation plays out vividly in a specific lawsuit.
The lawsuit against compulsory face masks in Amsterdam in August 2020, a fascinating moment of judicial transparency, even though they lost the case.
The key insight was an admission from the municipality itself.
Yes. Under oath, their defense team was forced to admit the mask experiment was not measuring clinical outcomes. They weren't trying to see if masks reduced infections.
So what were they measuring?
Purely behavioral parameters, compliance rates, how many people were on the street, mask usage, distance kept.
Which confirmed his theory.
It confirmed, by the government's own admission in court, that the policy was a behavioral experiment. It was about social control and compliance, not fundamentally about medicine.
That must have been a profound moment for him. Yet despite that insight, they kept losing key cases.
They lost the mask case, the YouTube censorship case, the case against the PCR test. And losing these, despite having strong legal backing, led him to conclude that the illusion of the rule of law was thrown away.
The judges were just prioritizing policy unity over legal principles.
Let's zoom in on that PCR test ruling, though, because it contained a critical semantic victory, even though the case was lost.
What was that?
The judge in that case made some crucial, often overlooked concessions. The court admitted that a PCR test is not a diagnosis on its own. It just detects viral material.
It also admitted you couldn't reliably use it for asymptomatic people.
And, most importantly, that positive tests could not be called patients.
And why is that technical distinction so vital?
Because it means the state had to concede that a positive test just means viral RNA is present, not necessarily active transmissible disease. It fundamentally undermined the foundation of their tracking system, which had equated every positive test with a case.
And did that change policy?
Not really. The state just quietly changed its dashboard terminology from disease cases to positive tests, an administrative sidestep that acknowledged the court's point without changing anything on the ground.
So even when legal logic prevailed technically, the state just adapted the semantics.
And this sense of the system just bending the rules sets the stage perfectly for the dramatic confrontation over the curfew.
The Avon clock, implemented in January 2021, arguably the most significant restriction on liberty in the Netherlands for decades.
And Waarheid challenged it immediately, which led to maybe the most intense legal drama of the whole period.
It was based on emergency law, right?
Yes, and the legal argument from Jerome Pols was masterful in its simplicity. It rested on a fundamental distinction.
Which was?
He argued that emergency powers can only be used against a real, clear, and present danger. A danger that is immediately observable.
Like a dike breaking.
Exactly. A physical catastrophe you can see with your own eyes. The curfew, however, was based on potential danger, on mathematical models, and fear of future variants.
So a forecast isn't enough to justify taking away fundamental rights.
That was the argument. A state of emergency has to be recognizable to the man on the street. Ambulances everywhere, hospitals overflowing. Since that wasn't happening, the use of emergency powers was illegal.
And the shock ruling came when the judge agreed with him.
Ordered the curfew lifted immediately, which sent the government into absolute chaos.
The government's response was frantic.
And, according to the sources, a clear demonstration of that alleged coup mechanism in action. Within 4 hours of the ruling, a cabinet session was convened. The verdict was suspended almost immediately.
Neutralized before the sunset.
And most significantly, the law itself was retroactively modified before the appeal was even heard.
They changed the legal basis to legitimize an act a court had just declared illegal.
That is the claim. And for Engel, this confirmed his belief that truth and legal victories are meaningless if the system can just rewrite the rules on the fly.
The appeal hearing itself then turned into this major courtroom confrontation.
The environment was toxic. Jerome Pols was forcefully silenced and threatened with removal by the presiding judge just for trying to speak on procedural points.
Did the sources provide any context on this particular judge?
They noted she was known for her prior involvement in the high-profile Urgenda climate ruling. This suggested, in Engel's view, a pre-existing tendency toward judicial activism that favored state intervention over strict procedure.
But the really damning detail about the court's preparation was about the challenge chamber.
Yes, the raking schemer. This is the special body that reviews a challenge against a judge's impartiality.
And
Pols had indicated he was challenging the judge's bias, but the sources claim the raking schemer was already assembled and waiting in a back room.
proving the court had anticipated the challenge and predetermined the outcome before the hearing even began.
That's the allegation. Undeniable proof to them that the judicial system had closed ranks.
And there was another detail, a slip of the tongue from the judge.
A very telling moment. The judge referred to his organization not by its legal name, Virus Warhide, but by the media's derogatory term, Virus Wahnsinn, virus insanity.
Showing she was influenced by media framing, not impartial evidence.
That's how he saw it. And despite that initial victory, the curfew was eventually upheld on appeal. His final conclusion was stark.
That the entire process was illegal.
And that it proved the judiciary was rotten through and through, just acting as lackeys of power.
Moving beyond the courtrooms, the media and political establishment used really aggressive framing tactics.
The source material reviews reports labeling him a brandstichter, an arsonist, and a sect leader. They often focused on social division, claiming 4 out of 10 people were fighting over these issues.
And Engel's counter-argument
Was that the division wasn't caused by his message of questioning the rules, but by the collectivist ideology the state was pushing.
the idea that my safety depends on your compliance.
Exactly. That, he says, is what created the social friction and pressure, not the protest.
We see this collectivist narrative articulated very clearly by Hugo de Jong, the Minister of Health.
De Jong explicitly framed vaccination not as a personal choice, but as a moral duty for the collective. Do it for the people you love.
And he had that infamous analogy.
Equating vaccine skepticism with eating junk food, saying, you've eaten frickin' Dell your whole life and you don't know exactly what's in those either.
And how did Engel view de Jonge's approach?
He saw him as just a salesman, reciting a script without real conviction. But the narrative itself, he asserts, pushed a dangerous fascist sentiment.
The idea that the majority can restrict the rights of the minority for the so-called greater good.
Which was echoed by major commentators like Johan Dirksen, who said he'd never heard a valid argument against the jab and supported pressing the unvaccinated.
That solidified the collective pressure.
It reinforced the idea that critics shouldn't be debated, just ignored or penalized until they complied.
Let's turn to a critical, long-term topic: unexplained overmortality.
The sources detail that significant 2023 parliamentary debate where figures like Peter Omsic raised the alarming figure of over 14,000 extra unexplained deaths in 2022 alone.
And 2022 was well past the initial severe phase of the pandemic.
Exactly. While the official explanation often centered on deferred care and misdiagnoses, the sheer number of unexplained deaths remain a huge political and scientific puzzle.
And crucially, we have a striking admission from Ernst Kuipers.
Yes, who was chairman of the National Acute Care Network before becoming health minister. He admitted publicly that the curfew,
The one upheld through all that legal maneuvering.
had no effect at all on hospital admissions. A crucial retrospective validation for Engel's argument about disproportionality.
But regarding the overmortality, Engel offers a very specific and dramatic claim about the cause.
Based on CBS data from February 2024, he argues the puzzle is easily solved by looking at granular data, specifically the difference between a person's declared vaccinated status and their actually vaccinated status.
And he zeroes in on one specific round of injections.
The third injection round, not the standard booster, but an extra dose given specifically to the immunocompromised group.
Why that specific group?
This group was told they needed more protection. Engel claims that if you analyze the data, thousands in this specific vulnerable group died in the Netherlands as a direct result of receiving this third injection.
That is a staggering claim.
He describes this campaign as the closest thing to genocide in the Netherlands during that period, based on the high fatality rate he sees in the data immediately following that injection in that narrow cohort.
Finally, we turn to the international context, where Engel saw the form of resistance he thought was necessary.
The Canadian Freedom Convoy in the winter of 2021-2022.
He calls this the key and the height of the global protest movement.
Because it achieved physical civil disobedience on a massive scale. It didn't just protest symbolically. It physically occupied key infrastructure, most notably the Ambassador Bridge, a vital U.S.-Canada trade link.
Hitting commerce is what made it so effective.
It hit the regime where it truly hurts the economy. It proved that mass, peaceful physical obstruction could break the power structure.
And the government response was, of course, severe.
Freezing bank accounts, arrests, seizing trucks, enormous fines, all designed as deterrents. But Engel stresses that the protest succeeded because it was physical, peaceful, and had massive public support. It showed the worldwide coup narrative was vulnerable.
So this decade-long conflict, from Fort Oranje to the legal battles, all culminated in Engel himself becoming a key target.
Starting with the mass criminal complaint initiated by Norbert Bickboom, which got an astonishing 22,000 signatures.
And the complaint accused him of severe offenses.
Incitement, fraud, spreading medical disinformation, and even expressions with a terroristic intent.
But Engel alleges this wasn't an organic movement.
No, he claims it was a coordinated media campaign, that the Public Prosecution Service, the OM, used collaborators like Dickboom to launch legal actions intended solely to defame and ruin political opponents.
What specific tactics did the prosecution allegedly use?
His defense sources claim they actively falsified evidence, cutting and pasting fragments of his speeches out of context, distorting 6 out of 7 of his alleged inciting statements to make them look criminal.
The goal, in his view, was not justice.
The goal was to secure silence, to discredit him and make him rightless, to paint him as a half-criminal or terrorist in the public eye.
This intense pressure led to 4 arrests. Let's talk about the 2 most significant ones in 2022.
The circumstances were striking. The first arrest on March 16th happened moments after he'd finished voting.
And the second was the one filmed on the highway.
Yes, on April 3, while he was driving to a demonstration, the grounds were an alleged violation of his parole conditions, specifically giving interviews or using social media. The method was very heavy-handed.
And Engel's assessment was that the goal was clear.
To silence him and prevent him from preparing for his ongoing legal defense, which it did. His curfew cassation appeal was handled while he was detained.
But the public backlash to that highway arrest was huge.
He compares it to a curfew effect, a moment when public opinion turned against the state's heavy-handedness.
And this public pressure led to a significant moment in the judiciary.
In the Radkammer, the council chamber, which reviews the legality of provisional detention, the judge, in his release hearing, actually referenced external media critique.
What did the judge reference?
Volkskrant articles that argued arresting someone just for giving interviews was untenable and dictatorial. The court, bowing to that pressure, concluded that requiring an individual to remain silent as a condition of liberty was incompatible with democratic principles.
So the state's attempt to silence him was ultimately defeated not by legal argument alone,
but by public outcry documented in the media. That is his final, powerful assessment, that every step of the legal process was predetermined, and the only thing that broke the system was external, public pressure. It proved to him that activists are rendered rightless unless massive public opinion intervenes.
Looking across this entire range of source accounts, the core tension is relentlessly consistent.
It is. It's the battle between Engel's evidence-based critique focused on aerosols and the low CFR, and a rigid, politically driven collectivist ideology. An ideology that, as he describes it, was intent on implementing measures and just achieving compliance.
And the Fort Oranje case is presented as the essential template for understanding his entire perception of government conduct.
Absolutely. The government allegedly operating outside the law to ruin a business.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner? This deep dive really forces us to confront the question of whether our democratic institutions are robust enough to handle a security-driven crisis response.
Engel's sources conclude that truth alone, even proven facts and initial court wins, is not enough to defeat what he repeatedly calls a dictatorship.
He argues that only widespread physical civil disobedience, inspired by the individual sacrifices of people like the Canadian truckers or through his own arrests, can halt these alleged power mechanisms.
The narrative emphasizes that knowledge is power, but action is required to apply it. The system, according to the source material, is designed to ignore or crush scientific truth if that truth conflicts with the desired political narrative.
Which leaves us with this provocative thought for you to consider. If the source claims that truth alone is not enough to defeat a dictatorship, and only widespread civil disobedience can halt these alleged power mechanisms, what then is the ultimate responsibility of the well-informed individual when faced with information they deeply mistrust, to keep seeking knowledge or to transition to action?